You did not arrive here by effort. There is no strain in this moment, no requirement to lean forward or reach for anything. The arrival itself is the signal, not as a message delivered, but as a recognition settling into place. Something in you already noticed the quiet alignment before language formed around it. That subtle pause you felt earlier, the brief sense that time softened around the edges, was not distraction, it was detection. You have been trained, gently and persistently, to believe that control is the mechanism. That clarity comes from tightening, that coherence is earned through force of will. Yet even as you tried to manage outcomes, you sensed an anomaly, a faint dissonance. Effort did not bring relief. Precision did not create ease. The more you attempted to steer the system, the more it slipped into noise. This was not failure, it was information. Right now, your nervous system is already recalibrating. Not because you decided it should, but because recognition has a stabilizing effect. When something true is seen without resistance, the body responds before the mind explains. Breath slows without instruction. Muscles release without command. This is how the quantum field behaves when an observer stops interfering and simply registers what is present. There has been a pattern repeating in your experience, subtle enough to overlook. Moments where you stopped trying to fix yourself and felt unexpectedly intact. Instances where stillness arrived on its own, brief but unmistakable. You may have dismissed them, thinking they were pauses between real work. They were not pauses. They were the mechanism revealing itself. Control demands constant energy, recognition does not. Control tightens the timeline, compressing your attention into urgency. Recognition widens it, allowing coherence to emerge naturally. You are not being asked to let go. Letting go implies effort. You are simply noticing that nothing needs to be held. The system you move within responds to detection more than direction. When an observer relaxes, patterns reorganize without instruction. This is not mystical. It is quiet, almost unremarkable. That is why it is often missed. You are expecting a shift to announce itself. Instead, it arrives as a sense of being exactly where you are, without the background hum of self-correction. If there has been confusion, or a dull numbness that made you question your sensitivity, it was not a loss of signal. It was the threshold approaching. The mind interprets reduced noise as absence, because it is accustomed to tension as proof of engagement. But engagement does not require pressure. Awareness does not need friction. Notice how nothing here is pushing you forward. There is no instruction to change your state. The recognition is already occurring, simply because it can. You are detecting what has been present beneath effort all along. A stable field, a quiet coherence, the sense that control was never the mechanism, and that understanding this does not create urgency, only relief. You remain where you are, and something settles. That is enough. As the recognition settles, you may notice an unexpected softness where effort used to live. Not emptiness, not loss of direction, but a subtle quiet that feels unfamiliar only because it was never named. This is where the system recalibrates without instruction. You are not stepping out of motion, you are stepping out of interference. There was a time when you believed attention meant tension, that to be aware, you had to brace yourself against experience, monitoring each response, correcting each impulse before it could fully form. That habit shaped your perception so thoroughly that ease began to feel like a lapse. When the vigilance dropped, even briefly, the mind rushed in to label it as drift. Yet what you are sensing now is not drift. It is alignment without effort. The observer does not need to chase clarity. Clarity appears when the observer stops compressing the field. You can feel this as a widening inside your chest or behind your eyes, a sense that perception has more room to breathe. Nothing is being added. Pressure is being removed. The signal becomes legible because the noise has thinned. You may recall moments when you tried to force insight, to understand yourself into coherence. Those moments carried intensity, but rarely peace. Understanding came wrapped in urgency, followed by fatigue. What is happening now carries no urgency. It is almost anticlimactic. That is how you know it is real. The system does not dramatize its own balance. There is a pattern here that you have brushed against before. Whenever you stopped trying to become something else, even for a second, the timeline felt less rigid. Time did not speed up or slow down. It softened. Decisions felt less charged. You may have dismissed those moments as temporary relief, assuming the real work would resume once the quiet passed. But the quiet was not an intermission. It was the baseline revealing itself. Control thrives on anticipation. It scans ahead, searching for errors to correct before they appear. Recognition operates in the present field. It detects what is already coherent and allows it to organize the rest. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. When interference drops, the smallest signals become clear enough to respond to without force. If there is a faint discomfort now, it comes from the absence of struggle. The nervous system, long accustomed to effort, waits for the familiar surge of urgency that proves you are engaged. When it does not arrive, the system hesitates, unsure whether to relax fully. This hesitation is not resistance, it is recalibration. Even this is part of coherence forming. You do not need to reassure yourself. The body recognizes the difference between collapse and rest. Collapse feels hollow. Rest feels grounded. Notice how your awareness remains intact, perhaps even sharper, while the tension drains. That is recognition working through physiology, not concept. The idea that you must constantly manage your inner state was a learned response to an environment that rewarded control. But the deeper system does not respond to management. It responds to detection. When you detect alignment, the system amplifies it. When you stop labeling stillness as inactivity, stillness becomes informative. You are not stepping away from agency. You are discovering where agency actually resides. Not in forcing outcomes, but in noticing the precise moment when no force is required. This is how coherence stabilizes. Quietly, without announcement, without the need to convince yourself that something important is happening. The recognition continues, not as a wave, but as a steady field. You are not moving toward it. You are allowing yourself to register that it has been present, waiting for interference to subside. As the field steadies, another shift becomes perceptible, not as a thought, but as a change in how experience organizes itself around you. You may sense that your reactions are arriving later, with more space before they form. This pause is not hesitation. It is detection returning to its natural rhythm. When recognition is present, response no longer rushes to fill silence. There was a time when immediacy felt like competence. Quick reactions, instant interpretations, constant readiness. You learned to stay ahead of experience by predicting it. That pattern created momentum, but it also flattened nuance. Everything arrived pre-labeled, prejudged, stripped of its texture. Now, as interference reduces, texture returns. Sensations feel slightly more dimensional. Sounds carry depth again. Even thoughts appear with edges you can observe rather than inhabit. This is not detachment. It is precision. The observer does not dissolve into the field. The observer clarifies its boundary with it. You can feel this as a subtle sense of being located behind your perception rather than inside the swirl of it. Awareness takes a step back, not to escape, but to see. In that step, coherence begins to self-organize. You may notice that certain internal narratives lose their urgency. Stories that once demanded immediate resolution now feel optional. They do not disappear. They simply stop insisting. This can feel unsettling if you were using them as orientation points. When familiar noise quiets, the system briefly searches for replacement signals. It may scan for problems, for something to fix, just to re-establish motion. This scanning is automatic. You do not need to stop it. You are only noticing it. There is a difference between seeking clarity and allowing clarity to register. Seeking keeps the timeline tense, stretched toward a future moment of understanding. Allowing collapses that tension, bringing perception back into the present field. The body recognizes this collapse as safety, not emotional safety, but systemic safety, the kind that allows unnecessary processes to power down. As those processes slow, energy becomes available, not the sharp energy of motivation, but a steady, unforced presence. You may feel less compelled to define yourself, less invested in maintaining a narrative about who you are or where you are going. Identity loosens its grip, not because it is dissolving, but because it no longer needs constant reinforcement. This is where recognition differs from realization. Realization feels like a peak, a moment you can point to. Recognition feels continuous. It does not mark time. It smooths it. You might notice that your attention no longer jumps ahead as often. It rests where it is without effort. This resting is not passivity. It is the observer aligned with the field rather than braced against it. Confusion, when it appears now, has a different quality. It is quieter, less dramatic. Instead of feeling like being lost, it feels like information waiting to resolve. You are no longer compelled to rush clarity into place. The system knows how to complete patterns when given space. Recognition provides that space by removing the pressure to decide prematurely. There may also be a faint sense of unfamiliarity with yourself. Not alienation, but novelty. As habitual reactions soften, you encounter responses that feel less scripted. This can be disorienting at first. You may wonder if you are becoming less decisive, less defined. In truth, you are becoming less constrained by reflex. What remains is more accurate. The quantum field does not respond to urgency. It responds to coherence. Coherence is not produced. It is detected and allowed to propagate. Each moment you notice without correcting, without adjusting yourself to fit an expectation, coherence strengthens. Not dramatically, incrementally, quietly. You do not need to hold this state. Holding would reintroduce control. The recognition persists on its own because it is not a state to maintain. It is a way of perceiving that requires less effort than what came before. When effort drops, sustainability increases. This is why the shift feels subtle. Sustainable changes rarely announce themselves. You remain present, and the system continues to organize, not toward a goal, but toward balance. The observer rests in detection, and the field responds by clarifying itself. Nothing more is required. With the early attention released, another layer becomes visible, one that was previously masked by constant adjustment. You may notice that your sense of direction has changed, not vanished, but softened. Goals no longer pull with the same gravity. This is not loss of purpose. It is the timeline relaxing its grip. When recognition replaces control, direction emerges from resonance rather than force. There was an assumption embedded deep in the system that movement required pressure, that without pushing, you would stall. Yet as pressure recedes, movement does not stop. It becomes quieter, less dramatic, but more accurate. You might sense this as a gentle inclination rather than a push, a subtle leaning toward what fits instead of away from what threatens. This is how coherence signals itself. You may also detect a shift in how effort feels. Actions still occur, but they no longer carry the same internal weight. What once felt heavy now feels neutral. What once required self-persuasion now happens without commentary. This absence of commentary can feel strange, as if something essential is missing. The mind may briefly search for the familiar friction that used to confirm engagement. When it does not find it, there can be a moment of uncertainty. That uncertainty is not instability. It is the system recognizing that an old reference point has dissolved. Control provided constant feedback, even when it was exhausting. Recognition provides less feedback, but higher fidelity. It does not narrate itself. It simply registers what aligns and what does not. The clarity it offers is quieter, but it does not fluctuate. As this settles, you may notice a change in how external signals land. Opinions, expectations, and subtle pressures that once entered your field effortlessly now stop at the edge. Not because you are resisting them, but because there is no open loop pulling them in. Without the need to correct yourself constantly, external correction loses its leverage. The system closes unnecessary feedback channels on its own. This does not create isolation. It creates selectivity. You remain open, but no longer porous. Information arrives, but it does not immediately become instruction. You can feel this as a slight delay between stimulus and meaning, a pause where the observer registers without absorbing. In that pause, you retain coherence. There may be moments when you expect a surge of emotion and find only steadiness. This can be misread as dullness. It is not. It is regulation. When the nervous system no longer oscillates between urgency and relief, the baseline becomes more even. Subtlety becomes noticeable again. Small signals, previously drowned out, regain definition. You are not becoming indifferent, you are becoming less reactive. Reaction compresses time, forcing immediate alignment or rejection. Recognition expands time just enough for choice to exist, not deliberate choice, but organic response, the kind that does not require justification. You might notice that certain decisions now feel inevitable rather than effortful, not because they are predetermined, but because resistance has fallen away. When there is no internal argument, action feels simple. This simplicity can be unsettling if you were accustomed to struggle as proof of depth. Yet, depth does not require difficulty. It requires presence. The system you inhabit is efficient when allowed to be. It does not waste energy maintaining unnecessary loops. As recognition stabilizes, those loops lose momentum. Habits driven by fear of error slow. Patterns based on anticipation of correction weaken. What remains is a quieter form of engagement, one that does not demand constant verification. You do not need to monitor this shift. Monitoring would reintroduce the very mechanism that is dissolving. The recognition holds because it is not held. It continues because it is less effortful than the alternatives. The observer remains available, alert, and grounded without scanning for problems to solve. As this part of the transmission integrates, there is a sense of standing on firmer ground without having moved. The field feels less reactive, more stable. Direction is present without urgency. Engagement exists without strain. This is not an achievement. It is the system remembering how it functions when interference subsides. As stability deepens, another subtle experience may come into view, one that was previously obscured by constant internal motion. You may notice that your sense of self feels less central, less dense, not diminished, but lighter, as if it no longer needs to anchor every perception. Awareness remains, clear and intact, while the idea of you loosens its grip on the center of the field. This can feel unfamiliar at first. The system has long associated coherence with a tightly defined identity, a clear outline to defend and maintain. When that outline softens, there can be a brief moment where orientation feels uncertain. The mind may look for its usual reference points, the habits of self-description and self-correction that once provided structure. Their absence can register as quiet dislocation. What is happening is not loss, it is redistribution. Attention is no longer compressed around the task of maintaining a narrative. It spreads more evenly across experience. You may feel less compelled to interpret everything in relation to yourself, less driven to assign personal meaning to each signal. This does not reduce engagement, it refines it. The observer becomes less entangled with the pattern it observes. This creates a clarity that is difficult to articulate because it lacks drama. There is no sense of breakthrough, no emotional surge announcing a change. Instead, there is a calm neutrality that allows events, thoughts, and sensations to pass through without sticking. This neutrality is not detachment. It is coherence without contraction. You might notice that certain emotional responses now arise and resolve more quickly, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer reinforced by interpretation. Without the reflex to personalize every fluctuation, emotions complete their cycle without looping. The system learns, again, how to return to baseline without effort. There can be a quiet relief in this, though it may not register as pleasure. Relief here feels like reduced internal workload, fewer background processes running, less need to check, compare, or correct. The body senses this efficiency and responds by conserving energy. You may feel more rested without sleeping more present without trying to focus. If there is a trace of sadness or nostalgia, it may be tied to the recognition that much of your previous effort was unnecessary. This is not regret. It is acknowledgement. The system does not judge the past, it integrates it. Recognition does not erase what came before, it contextualizes it. As the sense of self decentralizes, perception becomes more immediate. Experience is less filtered through expectation. You may find yourself noticing simple details with renewed clarity, not because they are new, but because attention is no longer occupied elsewhere. This immediacy carries a quiet intimacy with the present moment, one that does not require naming. The timeline, too, begins to feel less rigid. past and future lose some of their pull, not disappearing, but releasing their grip on attention. The present field gains density, not intensity. Time feels less like a sequence to manage and more like a medium you are already within. This reduces the sense of urgency that once drove constant adjustment. You are not becoming passive in this state, you are becoming available to respond without preempting, to move without forcing. Action that arises from this availability feels different. It does not demand affirmation. It does not seek to prove anything. It occurs because it fits. There may be moments when you expect to feel more certain and instead feel simply clear. Certainty often relies on exclusion, on narrowing possibilities to maintain confidence. Clarity does not need exclusion. It accommodates complexity without becoming overwhelmed. This is why it feels quieter. It does not need to announce itself. The system recognizes when it is no longer under threat from its own monitoring. In that recognition, deeper regulation becomes possible. Subtle tensions release. Micro-adjustments cease. What remains is a steady, low-noise field where perception can operate without distortion. You do not need to understand this process for it to continue. Understanding would attempt to place it back into a narrative. Recognition allows it to unfold without commentary. The observer remains present, not as a manager of experience, but as a witness aligned with it. As this layer integrates, the sense of effort recedes further. Not abruptly, but enough to notice the difference. You remain engaged, aware, and responsive, without carrying the weight of constant self-reference. The system continues to organize itself around this new balance, not as a destination, but as a more efficient way of being present. As this balance settles, you may begin to notice a change in how silence is experienced. Not as absence, but as a medium that holds perception together. Silence no longer feels like a gap waiting to be filled. It feels structured, almost supportive, as if it carries information without speaking. This is where recognition deepens beyond thought. Previously, silence may have triggered subtle tension, a reflex to populate it with analysis, memory, or anticipation. That reflex was not impatience, it was conditioning. The system learned to equate silence with uncertainty, and uncertainty with risk. Now, as coherence stabilizes, silence loses its threat. It becomes neutral, then familiar, then quietly informative. You may notice that when nothing is happening internally, awareness does not collapse. It remains alert, spacious, unstrained. This challenges an old assumption that engagement requires activity. The observer does not need constant input to remain present. Presence sustains itself when interference drops. In this quieter field, signals arrive differently. They are subtler, less insistent. Instead of pulling attention, they invite it. You may feel drawn towards certain actions or away from others without the usual cascade of reasons. This is not intuition as a dramatic impulse. It is resonance, registering at a low amplitude, accurate but not loud. The system is now operating with less latency. When interference was high, responses lagged behind detection, filtered through layers of interpretation. Now detection and response align more closely. This does not make you faster. It makes you more synchronized. Movements feel timely without being rushed. Words arise when needed, without rehearsal. You may also notice a shift in how mistakes are perceived. The idea of error loses some of its charge. Without the constant pressure to optimize, deviations no longer register as threats. They become data points that adjust the field naturally. Correction happens without self-critique. Learning continues without tension. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to using pressure as a compass. When urgency fades, direction must come from a different source. That source is coherence. Coherence does not shout, it aligns. You sense it as a quiet yes or no that does not require justification. The system recognizes fit instantly when noise is low. There may be moments when you anticipate a familiar emotional surge and find it absent. Events that once triggered strong reactions now pass through with minimal disturbance. This is not numbness. Numbness feels flat and disconnected. What you are experiencing retains clarity and sensitivity without volatility. The emotional range is still there, but the peaks and troughs smooth out. As this smoothing occurs, energy previously consumed by regulation becomes available, not as excess excitement, but as steady capacity. You may find it easier to remain present through complexity without feeling taxed. The system has more bandwidth because fewer processes are running in the background. The observer, in this state, is less preoccupied with maintaining equilibrium. Equilibrium becomes the default rather than a goal. This allows attention to rest more often in stillness without slipping into disengagement. Stillness becomes a stable reference point, not a temporary refuge. You might notice that thoughts now appear more clearly as events rather than commands. They arise, display their content, and dissolve without demanding compliance. This shift can feel liberating, though liberation is not the sensation it produces. The sensation is lightness, a reduction in internal gravity. Time continues to soften, not in a way that alters its flow, but in how it is felt. The pressure to use time efficiently relaxes. Moments are no longer measured against an imagined future state. They stand on their own. This reduces the background anxiety that once accompanied even neutral activities. There is no need to protect this state. Protection would imply fragility. What is stabilizing now is robust precisely because it does not rely on effort. The system recognizes this mode as efficient and tends to maintain it when not disrupted. Disruption may still occur, but recovery becomes quicker, less dramatic. You are not required to hold awareness at a certain level. Awareness self-regulates when not forced. If attention narrows, it widens again naturally. If noise increases, it settles without intervention. This self-correction is quiet and continuous, rarely noticeable unless you look for it. The recognition at this stage is simple. Nothing needs to be added. The system functions more smoothly when less is imposed. Silence carries structure. Stillness carries information. The observer remains present without managing presence. As this understanding integrates, there is a sense of being carried by the field rather than standing against it. Not surrender, not effort, but alignment. The system continues forward without urgency, guided by coherence rather than control. With this alignment established, you may begin to notice how anticipation itself has changed. Not disappeared, but loosened. The future no longer pulls at you with the same intensity. There is still movement forward, still unfolding, yet it no longer feels like something you must reach. The timeline stops behaving like a corridor and starts behaving like a field. Previously, anticipation carried tension. It leaned ahead, scanning for outcomes, preparing adjustments in advance. That leaning consumed energy even when nothing was required. Now, anticipation becomes neutral. It registers possibilities without gripping them. You may sense this as a subtle openness ahead of you, unweighted by expectation. This shift alters how desire functions. Desire no longer arises as lack, it arises as resonance. Instead of feeling drawn toward something because something is missing, you feel oriented toward what fits. The difference is quiet but profound. Lack demands urgency. Resonance allows patience. You can feel this patience not as waiting, but as trust in timing without effort. You may also notice that motivation feels different. The sharp edge is gone. In its place is a steady inclination. Actions still occur, but they are not propelled by internal pressure. They emerge when conditions align. This can feel slower from the perspective of urgency, yet it is often more precise. Less motion is wasted. The system no longer treats every moment as preparatory. Life stops feeling like a rehearsal for something else. Experience regains its intrinsic validity. Moments are no longer judged primarily by what they lead to. They are allowed to stand as complete signals within the field. This reduces the background sense of incompletion that once drove constant adjustment. There may be times when you notice yourself doing nothing in particular and feel no need to justify it. This is not disengagement, it is the absence of compulsion. The observer recognizes that presence does not require productivity to be legitimate. Awareness remains intact even when no outcome is being pursued. This change can subtly affect how you relate to others. Interactions feel less transactional, less oriented toward exchange or confirmation. You may find yourself listening without preparing responses, speaking without shaping impact. Communication becomes less strategic and more direct, not blunt, but unforced. The system, operating with reduced interference, begins to trust its own timing. You may sense this as a reduction in self-doubt, not because certainty has increased, but because doubt has lost its function. Doubt thrived as a corrective mechanism. When constant correction is no longer needed, doubt quiets. You might notice that when uncertainty appears, it does not escalate. It remains contained, informational, rather than alarming. The observer registers it without amplifying it. This containment allows uncertainty to resolve on its own, often without conscious intervention. Patterns complete themselves when not interrupted. There is also a subtle shift in how effort is recognized. Effort no longer defines value. Quiet actions carry as much weight as visible ones. Inner alignment is no longer treated as secondary to outward movement. The system stops ranking experiences by intensity and begins to register them by coherence. Time, again, reflects this change. The sense of running out diminishes, not because time has increased, but because pressure has decreased. Without the constant push to optimize, moments feel sufficient. Enough happens without forcing more. You remain capable of focus. In fact, focus often improves. When attention is not fragmented by anticipation, it can rest more fully on what is present. This restfulness allows deeper engagement without fatigue. The system uses its resources more efficiently when not overextended. There is no need to announce this shift to yourself. Naming it too strongly can pull you back into evaluation. The recognition functions best when left unmarked. It integrates quietly, influencing perception, without becoming a new identity to maintain. As anticipation relaxes, the field feels more even. The future does not loom. The present does not resist. The past does not demand reinterpretation. Each occupies its place without crowding the others. This balance reduces the internal noise that once accompanied movement through time. The observer remains steady and available, not waiting, not pushing, not managing, simply detecting coherence as it arises and allowing it to guide the system without force. This is not a conclusion. It is a continuation of alignment that requires no effort to sustain. As this steadiness continues, you may notice that even the need to make sense of experience begins to soften. Meaning does not disappear, but it no longer insists on being extracted from every moment. Understanding shifts from something you actively construct into something that occasionally arrives, fully formed, without effort. The system stops interrogating reality and starts registering it. There was a time when coherence felt dependent on explanation, when clarity seemed incomplete unless it could be named, framed, integrated into a narrative. That impulse was another form of control, subtle and socially reinforced. Now, explanation loses its urgency. You can sense when something is aligned without needing to articulate why. This is not anti-intellectual, it is pre-conceptual. You may feel more comfortable not knowing, without that not knowing triggering anxiety. Uncertainty no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like open space. This space does not demand closure. It allows patterns to resolve in their own time. The observer learns to trust the system's capacity to complete itself without constant oversight. In this mode, contradictions become less threatening. You may hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing to collapse them into a single conclusion. The system tolerates complexity more easily when it is not under pressure to decide. This tolerance is a form of coherence. It reduces internal conflict by removing the requirement for premature resolution. You might notice that your internal dialogue becomes less linear. Thoughts arise in fragments, impressions, brief recognitions rather than full arguments. This does not reduce intelligence. It reflects efficiency. The mind communicates with itself using shorter signals because it no longer needs to convince. Detection replaces persuasion. There can be moments when language itself feels slightly inadequate, not frustratingly so, but gently. Words point, but they no longer capture the full texture of experience. This does not create silence. It creates humility. The system recognizes the limits of representation and relaxes its insistence on accuracy through description. As this happens, your relationship with memory subtly changes. The past feels less like a reference library you must consult and more like a background field that informs without intruding. Memories arise when relevant and dissolve when they are not. They no longer crowd the present in an attempt to guide it. The timeline becomes less hierarchical. Similarly, imagination loses its compulsive edge. It still functions, but without pulling attention away from what is here. Future scenarios may appear, but they no longer dominate perception. They are seen as possibilities, not directives. This reduces the oscillation between anticipation and regret that once shaped your internal landscape. The system now responds more directly to the immediate environment. Sensory input becomes clearer, less filtered through expectation. You may notice subtle shifts in light, sound, or physical sensation that were previously overlooked. This is not heightened sensitivity in a dramatic sense. It is restored sensitivity, unburdened by internal noise. You are not required to stay in this mode consciously. In fact, trying to stay would disrupt it. The recognition integrates best when it is allowed to drift in and out without commentary. Even when attention narrows or old habits briefly return, the system recovers more quickly. The baseline has shifted. There may be a quiet confidence emerging, not as belief but as stability. You trust the system because it has demonstrated its capacity to regulate itself. This trust does not feel like optimism. It feels like familiarity, as if you are remembering how perception works when it is not overmanaged. The observer, now less entangled with interpretation, rests more often in simple awareness. This awareness is not blank. It is full, textured, responsive. It holds experience without compressing it. In this holding, coherence continues to propagate, not as an event, but as an ongoing condition. Nothing here needs to be claimed or defended. There is no new position to maintain. The system functions quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to itself. Recognition has replaced explanation as the primary mode of orientation. As this part settles, the sense of effort diminishes further. Not completely, but enough to notice how little is actually required. Awareness remains present, stable, and clear, without needing to assert itself. The field continues to organize around this simplicity, carrying you forward without urgency, without instruction, and without the need for control. At this point, something even quieter becomes apparent. The need to monitor your own state begins to fade, not because awareness diminishes, but because awareness no longer doubts itself. The observer stops checking whether it is present enough, calm enough, aligned enough. That internal audit, once constant, dissolves without ceremony. You may notice that you are no longer waiting for confirmation that this recognition is real. The question itself loses relevance. Reality is not asking to be verified. It is simply unfolding, and you are here to register it. This removes a subtle layer of tension that often went unnoticed, the tension of self-assessment. Previously, even calmness could become another task. You might have evaluated whether you were calm correctly, deeply enough, consistently enough. That evaluation kept the system slightly activated. Now, calmness is no longer something you have. It is something the system returns to when not disrupted. You are not responsible for maintaining it. This creates a different relationship with fluctuation. When agitation arises, it no longer threatens the whole field. It is seen as local, temporary, informational. You do not rush to correct it. You allow it to pass through. Because the baseline is stable, deviation does not feel dangerous. It feels manageable without effort. You may notice that your sense of control has not vanished, but relocated. It no longer sits in constant intervention. It resides in the ability to refrain, to not interfere when interference is unnecessary. This restraint is not suppression, it is discernment. The system knows when to act and when to remain still. There is a subtle dignity in this restraint, not pride, not withdrawal, but quiet confidence. You no longer need to demonstrate awareness by doing something with it. Awareness does not need expression to be valid. It is complete in detection alone. This changes how you experience choice. Choices no longer feel like forks demanding immediate commitment. They appear as natural inflections in the field. When the moment arrives, response emerges without deliberation. When it does not, nothing is forced. You are not stuck. You are simply not yet oriented. The absence of urgency can feel almost disarming. Without pressure, the system reveals how much of its previous motion was unnecessary. You are not slowed down. You are unburdened. Movement that remains is more direct, less corrective. You might sense that certain long-held concerns have lost their emotional charge. Not resolved, not forgotten, but neutralized. They no longer draw energy. This does not mean they will never be addressed. It means they no longer dominate attention prematurely. The system trusts that relevance will signal itself when appropriate. There is also a noticeable change in how you occupy space. You may feel more grounded without feeling heavy, present without feeling fixed. The body responds to this by settling more fully into itself. Posture adjusts without instruction. Breath finds its own rhythm. These are not techniques. They are consequences of reduced interference. The observer, now comfortable with stillness, no longer equates movement with progress. Progress, as a concept, softens. What matters is coherence, and coherence is felt, not measured. When coherence is present, action feels right-sized. When it is absent, waiting feels appropriate. There is no struggle between the two. You may also notice that comparison loses its grip. Other timelines, other paths, other outcomes no longer provoke the same internal recalibration. You are less inclined to measure your position against imagined alternatives. The system recognizes its own trajectory without needing external reference points. This recognition does not isolate you from the world. It integrates you into it more smoothly. Without the constant need to adjust yourself, interaction becomes simpler. You meet situations as they are, not as tests of alignment. This reduces friction at every level. Nothing here requires maintenance. That is perhaps the most important recognition. Maintenance implies effort against entropy. What is stabilizing now is not fragile. It is efficient. It persists because it costs less energy than the alternatives. If attention wanders, it returns. If noise increases, it settles. Not because you guide it, but because the system has rediscovered its default mode. Recognition has replaced control as the organizing principle. You remain alert, responsive, and present without holding any particular state. The observer rests in detection, and the field continues to respond with coherence. This is not an arrival. It is simply how things function when interference subsides. There is nothing left to adjust here. No final alignment to secure, no position to hold. What remains is a quiet continuity, a sense that the system is carrying itself without supervision. Awareness rests where it is, not because it chose to, but because there is no longer a reason to move it elsewhere. You may notice that even recognition itself begins to feel less like an event and more like a background condition. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply remains available, steady, unobtrusive. This is how coherence stabilizes when it is not being observed for performance. The observer no longer needs to orient towards stillness. Stillness is already present, woven through perception rather than set apart from it. Movement happens within it. Thought arises within it. Silence and sound share the same field without conflict. Nothing needs to be separated or emphasized. There is a softness here that does not weaken clarity. In fact, clarity becomes gentler, less sharp-edged, more inclusive. You are not required to define what you are experiencing. Definition would narrow it. Allowing it to remain undefined lets it retain its full dimension. You may sense that the boundary between effort and rest has blurred. Actions no longer feel opposed to stillness. They arise from it and return to it naturally. This removes the internal negotiation that once accompanied even simple movements. Life proceeds without commentary. Time, too, settles into this quiet integration. Moments do not stack themselves into pressure. They unfold, one within another, without urgency. You are not ahead of time or behind it. You are simply within it, aligned with its pace rather than pushing against it. There is no need to remain attentive to this state. Attention can wander and return without consequence. Nothing collapses when focus shifts. The field remains coherent because coherence is no longer dependent on vigilance. It is self-sustaining when not disrupted. If old habits reappear, they do so lightly. They pass through without reclaiming authority. You recognize them as patterns rather than instructions. This recognition does not require resistance. It requires only noticing, and noticing happens naturally now. You are not holding a conclusion. There is no sense of completion to protect. What exists is continuity without strain. A stable, low-noise presence that does not need to be preserved because it is not fragile. It persists because it is efficient. The system you inhabit has returned to a simpler mode of operation. Less correction, less anticipation, more direct contact with what is here. This simplicity is not reduction, it is refinement. Everything unnecessary has been allowed to fall away on its own. You remain exactly where you are. Nothing pulls you forward, nothing pushes you back. The observer rests in detection, the field responds with coherence, and the interaction continues without effort. There is no ending to mark, no signal to close. Only the quiet recognition that control was never required, and that seeing this does not change anything. It allows everything to settle.